Hello, class. This is one of my favorite topics, the 1920s. This is a time period where the United States is starting to look like we are today. There's a lot of things that we recognize about the 1920s. We have electricity, and electricity isn't everywhere, but our cities are starting to look like cities. Jazz music is the big popular music of the time. Um, and they had movies, restaurants. It's starting to look like modern day. Women are starting to act a little bit more like they do today. Not quite. It's subtle. Now then, I'm not saying I would get in a time machine, but I'm just saying that, look at this picture. It looks fun, to be able to go to a jazz club and get in a car, and the car has a radio. This is a lot different than just 10 years ago. The 20s changed everything. So this is a time of economic prosperity. You need to know that word. Prosperity, that's good stuff. Jazz, consumerism. People were just buying and buying and buying. And flappers. Not everyone was a flapper, but they symbolized how women were changing during this time period. Okay? So what do we mean by prosperity? What we mean is good stuff, just success. Okay, it was a good time in American history if you were white. Okay, let's be honest. Okay, all right. So the 20s would enter a new age of prosperity with automobiles, telephones, electricity, making life better. Okay, Americans began focusing on making more money and enjoying themselves. Okay? Now, let's keep in mind that Prohibition was going on in the 1920s. Because of the 18th Amendment, alcohol was illegal in this country for all through the 1920s up till 1933. It led to a rise in organized crime because, as you know, when you take a substance that people want and you make it illegal, then who's going to sell it, right? Okay. Think about the prohibition of marijuana now and compare it to the prohibition on alcohol during that time. You had illegal bars called speakeasies and bootleggers. Those were people who sold alcohol illegally. So now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have outlawed alcohol, but I will say this. America did have a really bad drinking problem up until this time. And yes, people did drink during the 1920s, but I did read this, that people did drink less in the 1920s. So think of it as kind of a drying out. If you compare drinking levels before the 20s and compare it to levels after the 20s, it did drop some. Okay, so Prohibition did work to some extent. Okay, so you got speakeasies, illegal bars. Okay, and you've got people who were selling alcohol and having clever ways of hiding it. By the way, the word bootleg came from people who used to sell whiskey out of their boots. They had like these boots, kind of like this here, but in their boots. That's where the word bootleg came from. In Canada didn't have prohibition, so people would fill their cars with alcohol and drive across the frozen lakes. Sometimes they would smuggle them inside pigs. And it did lead to a rise in organized crime. You've got the famous Al Capone. Now, I read a whole biography on Al Capone, and he said, you know what, alcohol was just one way I made money. I made money all kinds of ways, gambling, prostitutes, it wasn't just alcohol. And some people say that Al Capone wasn't as bad as people made him out to be, but he certainly was one of the famous ones. Okay, so here's a picture of Al Capone and his buddies. Okay. And by 1933, when the Great Depression had already started, the 21st Amendment was passed and it got rid of the 18th Amendment. It was the only time we got rid of an amendment to the Constitution. Okay? So Which of these resulted from the prohibition of alcohol during the 1920s? Okay, hit pause if you need to, but the answer is D, rise of organized crime. Okay. All right, there's a lot of stuff in the 1920s, so here you go. What is the Red Scare? Now, one thing I want you to understand is that the word red means something. It's a symbol for communism. And so in Russia, you had what was the Russian Revolution around this time, and then you had people in the United States who were communist. Some meant well. Some communists simply just wanted better working conditions for workers. Other communists wanted to blow things up. Look at this cartoon. You see that? That's a bomb from the time. Okay? So look at this cartoon. It's immigration restrictions, and the communists are trying to get in this country. The caption is "Close the Gate." So this cartoon is trying to make you afraid of immigrants. So the Red Scare happened in the 1920s, and it also happened again in the 1950s. It was a fear of communism driven by nativism and racism and fear of communists. As a result of this Red Scare, there was something called the Palmer Raids. Palmer was the director of the FBI, and his house got bombed. I mean, some communists blew up his house. So what would you do if you were the director of the FBI and this happened to you? Well, he did the same thing. He went around, he arrested a bunch of communists or suspected communists, thousands of them, and he deported a bunch of them. He threw some of them in jail. And this happened, I think, in the year 1919 or 1920. Okay? So look at this poster. The Red Menace is real. Report all suspected communist activity. So anytime you see the word red, I want you to think of the word communism. Okay? So look at that. When you look at the old Soviet Union flag, it was red. If you look at all the communist flags, they were red. Okay? And here's a fear-mongering poster. Is this tomorrow? America under communism. Okay? Look at this cartoon. Look at the sign. 249 Reds to Russia. Reds. Who are they deporting? Communist. Okay? So in 1919, the Communist Party was gaining strength in the United States, and Americans feared communism. In January 1920, Palmer raids in 33 cities broke into meeting halls and homes without warrants. 4,000 communists were jailed. Many innocent immigrants were deported. So, all right, so look at this question. And I'll be honest with you, I missed this question for a long time. Cartoons such as this one took the position that deportation was necessary because why? Okay, hit pause, do this question. All right, for years I thought the answer was B, because that's why, because of nativism, you kick out the immigrants. But then I saw this, look, it says alien Reds. And then I was like, oh crap, I missed this one. The answer is C. Communists were infiltrating the United States. So once you see Reds, I want you to think communist. All right. What was the primary reason for the raids described in this excerpt? Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer conducted a series of raids. The most spectacular of the Palmer raids occurred in January 1920. So why did the Palmer raids happen? The answer is to halt the spread of communist ideas by radicals. Okay? All right, I've never seen this on the test, but I just want to tell you about it real quick. Eugenics was a breeding program for Americans, specifically white people, let's be honest. And it was the belief that the human race could be improved by breeding. So what they would do is they would find these white couples who were healthy and didn't have a criminal record, who weren't alcoholics, and they would say, we want you to breed more. We want you to have 15 kids, and we'll even give you this certificate. It sounds innocent, but then what would happen is that they would find undesirables and castrate them. They would go up to alcoholics on the street and say, hey, you're a loser. Come down to the eugenics clinic. And then they would convince these losers to get sterilized. And sometimes in jails, they would sterilize people without their permission. That's the eugenics movement. Okay? 60,000 people were sterilized from 1909 to 1960 nationwide. And some of them were involuntary, some of them were voluntary. And that's where Hitler got the idea of purifying the race. That's where Hitler got the idea, from America. Okay? Interracial marriage and incest were banned partly due to eugenics. Okay. All right, so moving right along. So the 1920s was characterized by Republican presidents. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that during the 1920s, the government tended to be more laissez-faire, hands off. So think about it. Gilded Age, laissez-faire, progressive era, more government intervention. And then in the 1920s, let's back off and let the economy do its thing. And it worked for a few years. During the 1920s, the economy was awesome. Okay? You've got Warren Harding running for president in 1920, and he ran a campaign called Return to Normalcy. That was his campaign slogan. And after World War I, that's what people wanted. World War I only lasted a year, but you take World War I and you combine that with the Spanish flu epidemic that was going on, and people just wanted to get back to normal, go back to isolationism. Let's focus on us. You know, Trump says America first. Well, Warren Harding says, let's go back to not getting involved in Europe's wars. Another thing that I want you to understand about Warren Harding is that there was a scandal. It seems minor compared to today, but the Teapot Dome scandal, where one of his cabinet members was arrested for bribery. Okay? So internationally, the United States stayed out of the League of Nations. Why? Because the United States wanted to not get involved in entangled alliances. We just didn't want to get involved in Europe's crap anymore. So we did not join the League of Nations. All right, the Teapot Dome scandal. There was a scandal, and what happened was there was a piece of land, a federal piece of land called Teapot Dome. And they found oil on this land. And the Secretary of Interior, you know, one of Harding's cabinet members, took bribes so the oil companies could drill for oil on this federal land. Well, that's illegal. You can't do that. You can't let a private company drill for oil on public land. That's illegal. And you certainly can't take a bribe. So somebody went to jail, and it embarrassed Warren Harding. So check this out. Read this in a man's voice. This is Warren Harding running for president. America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not revolution, but restoration. Not submergence in internationality, but sustainment in triumphant nationality. Okay, hit pause, read it again if you need to, answer the question. But the answer is A. help the country recover from the turmoil of the previous decade. What was the previous decade? World War I, Spanish flu, getting involved in Europe's crap. Why did the return to normalcy agenda of the United States presidential candidate Warren Harding appeal to many voters in the 1920 election? The answer is the public wanted to concentrate on domestic economic issues. Domestic, that means home. Like a domestic car, that's like Ford, Chevy. Domestic means us, America, us. Focus on us, not on Europe. Okay? And if I answered it too quickly, that means you didn't hit pause. You need to hit pause. Okay? Otherwise, you're not doing what you need to do. Okay? This 1924 cartoon satirizes a scandal that led to what? Okay, hit pause. Okay, now here's something to think about. Go with the only answer that mentions corruption. Public disappointment over revelations of government corruption. Okay, scandal, corruption, pretty much the same thing. Okay. Which headline describes a consequence of the Teapot Dome scandal? Okay, hit pause if you need to. The answer is D. Okay. All right, Herbert Hoover, nice guy, good guy. He made the cover of Time magazine because he was helping war-torn Europe and helping the poor. Good guy. He believed in a laissez-faire government, rugged individualism, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Unfortunately, we eventually will blame him for the Great Depression, even though it's not really his fault. But he was a good guy, but he was a one-term president. All right, now this is important. Write this down if you need to. Why was the 1920s economy prosperous? Why was our economy so good in the 20s? Well, there's a few things. Mass production, okay? Meaning that people like Henry Ford learned to take something expensive like a car and learn to make it cheap. People were starting to buy on credit. Installment plans, meaning you take it home and then you pay it out in payments. So people were buying more because of that. And laissez-faire government. And the stock market was doing great for a few years. Now, this is a fake newspaper, okay? But, that's the Onion. That's fake news. But anyway, the stock market was great for a few years. Okay. Write this down if you need to. Okay. All right. So again, there was a lot of consumerism, mass consumption during the 1920s. There were plenty of jobs. People had jobs. Even African Americans had jobs. Okay, everyone was making money. The stock market was doing really well. Look at this down here. Buy today, pay later. Okay. Okay, now they didn't have credit cards, but they did have buy now, pay later. Okay. So the automobile did a lot for the economy. Remember, if people were buying cars, which they were, then that means people had jobs in gas stations, people had jobs in hotels, car repair places. It stimulated industries in oil, steel, glass, rubber, radios, because eventually cars are going to have radios. All of that is going to expand the economy. Oh, and people who sell cars too. Okay, gas stations. So the automobile is going to create jobs. Oh, and building roads, building picnic areas, all of that is going to create jobs in this country. Okay, and socially, it's also going to give people mobility. I mean, instead of taking a horse for a ride around, you're going to take a car for a ride around. And women were driving in cars. That's going to change the social dynamics of everything. Imagine a bunch of women in a car having the freedom to go somewhere. They didn't have that before. Okay, riding a horse just isn't the same. Okay, so the car is going to change everything. Now remember, Ford did not invent the car, but what he did do is he made the assembly line to where he could lower the price of a car. The automobile used to be, Ford started the Model T at $800 a car, and it dropped to $300 a car. Okay? So he didn't invent the car, but he invented more efficient production techniques. And that's going to be used in other products as well. A lot of things were invented in the 20s. The toaster, vacuum cleaners, obviously the light bulb was around, the electric refrigerator, the electric stove. There's another toaster. Electric coffee machine with a little toaster at the bottom. Okay. Electric stove. No more sticking wood burning stoves, which were dangerous. Okay. Radios. All right, so check this out. During the 20s, what was one result of innovations in U.S. transportation technology? All right, hit pause. And the answer is B. The automobile was big in the 20s. None of this other stuff was big in the 20s. Okay. Which of these is an example of a successful innovation of the assembly line production model? Okay, now this isn't about the 20s, but it is about the assembly line. Hit pause, do the best that you can. Which one of these can be done with an assembly line? And the answer is C. That can be done with an assembly line. So in the 20s, people had mass consumption. People were buying. Advertising was a new industry. That was a new industry. The billboards were a new thing. Because, you know, now that you have roads, you can have billboards. Okay? And then advertising made people want to buy more. So that was new. Okay, more advertising. Look at that. $2 down, $3 a month. Installment plans. Okay? There's some fashion, ladies' fashion of the 20s. People were buying radios. No television yet. Television won't come around until the 50s. So modern day consumerism and modern day mass consumption, that's people wanting to buy all the time. Okay? All right, I don't want to make a big deal out of this. I've only seen it on the EOC once, but there was a trial of a biology teacher in Tennessee or Kansas, I forget which one, but a biology teacher went to jail for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, okay? And that was illegal at the time. So you had this big old trial called the Scopes Monkey Trial. And basically it was a fight over modern science versus traditional religion, okay? And I've only seen it once, but basically it was a fight over modern science versus traditional religion. And this is The Onion. That's a fake newspaper. But really, I mean, what else is a biology teacher supposed to teach? You know? But the Bible says no, sort of. Anyway, so Clarence Darrow defended the biology teacher. William Jennings Bryan prosecuted. It was all over the radio. It was all over the news. And basically, it was a conflict between modernism and traditionalism. Okay? Flappers. You know, we always have some sort of counterculture movement. Okay? And during the 20s, women were really starting to change socially. They were starting to look different, act different. They dressed different. They started showing their arms, their legs. They cut their hair short. They were smoking in public. They were drinking in speakeasies. They had freedom of the automobile. They were listening to that devil's music called jazz. And not all women were flappers, but they did symbolize this new freedom that women had during the time. No more corsets. And also keep in mind this term counterculture. In the 20s, you had flappers. In the 50s, you had beatniks, hipsters. In the 60s, you had hippies. In the 80s, you had punks. And then modern day, we have goths, emos, things like that. So my point is that I'm trying to teach you the word counterculture. People who always go against the grain. Okay? Not all women were flappers in the 20s. These are teachers, secretaries. Okay? All right. I've never seen this on the EOC, but there was a region in New York City called Tin Pan Alley. It was like a street, and they were famous for sheet music publication, pop music. So if you think of what is the popular music of the time, yes, there was jazz, but there was also ragtime. Okay, so when you think of music like Ice Cream Man, that's a popular ragtime. But think about, and so Tin Pan Alley would sell this sheet music to people around the country. That's what they were known for. Never seen that on the EOC yet. All right, I have seen this, the Great Migration. Write this down if you're taking notes. Remember push factors and pull factors. You got the Jim Crow South, you got segregation, you got racism, you got poor job opportunities, not a lot of cities in the South. So a lot of African Americans left the South to go where? Where did they go? They went to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and especially Detroit. What was going on in Detroit? Henry Ford and his automobile. And he paid African Americans the same as he paid white people. $5 a day, which was a lot of money back then. And so jobs are a pull factor. People left the South, they brought their culture with them, and it changed the culture of the North. Okay. So, which pull factor contributed to the Great Migration? The answer is B, jobs. It's always jobs. Okay. All right, so hit pause and read this. Over the course of 6 decades, some 6 million black Southerners left the land and went elsewhere. Why did they do that? Because of the push factor of limited jobs. Why don't they just say jobs? They always say economic opportunities. Okay. This is an interesting question. Which sequence best completes this sequence of event? African Americans organized black churches in the South. Northern black churches are influenced by Southerners during the Great Migration. And then your answer. The answer is D, gospel music. Gospel music. Okay? So they brought their music with them. Harlem Renaissance. So if you were African American and you had a time machine and you went back to the 1920s, hurry to get to Harlem. Don't go anywhere else. Okay? Harlem is the one place in America where African Americans can pretty much be themselves. You had jazz, you had the beginnings of the early civil rights movement. Remember, just a few years before, W.E.B. Du Bois founded the NAACP. Okay? You've got jazz, you've got black flappers, okay? You've got Duke Ellington, who was very famous with jazz in the 20s. Louis Armstrong, remember the song, Oh, when the saints go marching in, oh, when the saints go marching in. That's Louis Armstrong. And Duke Ellington, you may remember him from Big Mouth. That's Duke Ellington. You got Calloway, who had a famous song, The Reefer Man, because all the jazz musicians smoked pot back then. Okay. So you got literature in the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, You've got other people with poems and novels. Okay, the Harlem Renaissance was a good time for African Americans in the 1920s. Okay. Negroes, sweet and docile, meek, humble and kind. Beware the day they change their mind. Langston Hughes. Okay. And so the 20s Harlem saw the beginning of the civil rights movement. The new Negro has no fear. Okay, so we're still 30 years away from Martin Luther King Jr., but you could start to see that people are starting to think about things like that. Okay. You've also got Marcus Garvey, who was a separatist. He said, there is nothing here in America for us. Let's raise money and let's get on a ship. Let's go to Africa and let's create our own country. And they did. That country is Liberia. Okay, so he was a separatist. Okay. Which of the following was a major contribution of the Harlem Renaissance to U.S. culture? Okay, just look for something. Hit pause. The answer is C, jazz. That's one of them. Which of these cause and effect relationships is accurate? Okay, hit pause. And the answer is C. All right, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. The halls and the verandas are gaudy with primary colors and hair shorn in strange new ways and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. How does this excerpt reflect a significant turning point in American history? Hit pause. And the answer is B, the Jazz Age. Remember, they call this the Jazz Age as well. All right. Charles Lindbergh, I don't know if I've seen him on the test yet, but this guy's crazy. He got in a single-engine airplane, took off from America, flew over the Atlantic Ocean, landed in France, and he did it in 36 hours. He was the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. So he was like an astronaut. He did something crazy and dangerous. I mean, what would have happened if he got lost? Okay, or he ran out of gasoline, or the winds changed direction. You know, he had no radar back then. Okay, but that's what Charles Lindbergh did. Okay, moving right along. So speculation. The economy was really good, but for a while, people were doing something called speculation. Speculation is when you buy stocks, but you don't intend on holding on to it for very long. You buy stocks, you hold on to it for a week or a month, and then you sell it when the price goes up. That is called speculation. And when too many people do it, it creates a roller coaster in the stock market. It creates ups and downs in the stock market. Today, we use the word speculation for lots of things. Like, for example, if you were to buy this house in Bishop Arts for $315,000 and you were a speculator, what would you do with it? Well, you might wait a year and sell it for $400,000. Okay, that's speculation. You buy it, you flip it, you sell it for more, you make a profit on it. And if you do that with stocks, then you're a stock speculator. Oil speculators are the reason why oil goes up and down. Right now, gas is cheap, but I remember a few years ago, these were the gas prices because of oil speculators. Of course, everyone blamed President Bush or President Obama, but it's not the president's fault. It's oil speculators. So they did this with the stock market. People would buy stocks, sell them, and what would happen is the stock markets would go up and down like a roller coaster. And you need to write this down if you're taking notes. What caused the stock market to crash in 1929? And you do need to memorize that year. Over speculation caused the stock market to crash. And also buying stocks on margin. In other words, they would buy stocks on credit. So they would go to the bank and say, I'd like to buy some stocks. The bank would buy the stocks for them, and you only had to give like 10% down or something. And then when the stock goes up, then you would just pay the bank off. But what if the stocks crash? You know, and then you can't pay the banks. Then the banks go bankrupt. Okay? So in 29, the stock market crashed, and that's going to be the beginnings of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the Roaring Twenties are over. The stock market crash of 29 will start the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Depression will last until World War II. That will end the Great Depression. All right, so here is a question about time periods. The Roaring Twenties were characterized by what? Be careful on this one. All right, if you answered B, that's the 1930s. The answer is C, Prohibition, flappers, installment plans. If you answered A, that's the 40s. And D, that's the 50s. Okay? Which of the following directly contributed to the economic instability of the United States in 1929? Memorize that date. So that's the stock market crash, so the answer is B, over speculation. That is it. Thank you very much.